The envelope trembles in James's weathered hands, kitchen light casting long shadows across the dining table where 40 years of family meals had unfolded. His coffee grows cold, forgotten as he reads the words again. Divorce papers, clinical and impersonal after 4 decades together. A single tear escapes, landing on their anniversary photo. The grandfather clock ticks accusingly in the silence, each sound marking another moment of his collapsing world. Has betrayal ever blindsided you like this? Share your story below. Like if it resonates with your heart, follow to see how James fights for his dignity. His throat tightens, shoulders curving inward as he traces his grandchildren's faces in the framed photo nearby. Will they still visit once the family splinters? The carefully built retirement, the legacy he thought secure, all suddenly uncertain. Outside, a car door slams, jarring him back to the reality requiring immediate action rather than tears. James settled into his leather chair, the study quiet, except for the grandfather clock's steady rhythm. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across the lawn where grandchildren had played just last Sunday. His phone chimed softly, Catherine's tone. 40 years of marriage had taught him her schedules. She wasn't due home for hours yet. The screen illuminated his weathered face as he tapped the message open. His breath caught, a sudden stillness overtaking him. I want a divorce. All communication through lawyers from now on. Do not call or text me directly. Time seemed to stop. The clock's ticking grew unnaturally loud in the suspended moment. James read the message again, eyes tracking each cold word. The phone grew heavy in his hand, as if the message itself had physical weight. Not Catherine, not after all these years. His index finger hovered over the keyboard, a slight tremor betraying the storm beneath his composed exterior. He drew a deliberate breath, steadying himself. The financial planner in him, 35 years balancing other people's futures, assessed the situation with unexpected clarity. Understood. He typed the single word, sent it, then placed the phone face down on the side table with careful precision. Only then, certain of his solitude, did James allow a single tear to form. It tracked slowly down his lined cheek, catching the lamplight before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. His gaze drifted to the silver-framed photo on his desk. Last Thanksgiving, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Catherine beside him. Had she been planning this even then? The family they'd built together, the retirement they'd mapped out on walks along the beach, the decades of shared holidays, arguments resolved, celebrations savored, all dismissed in a 12-word text message. James's throat tightened. His hand moved to the photograph, fingers lightly tracing the faces of his grandchildren. Would he still see them regularly? Would holidays become negotiated visitations? The family legacy he'd worked his entire life to build, financially and emotionally, suddenly stood on shifting sand. Ain't how folks end 40 years, he whispered to the empty room, the rare colloquialism slipping out from his Tennessee childhood. Something fluttered in his chest, not just grief, but the stirring of questions. Why a text? Why now? Catherine avoided confrontation, yes, but this level of detachment seemed calculated, almost as if the old accountant's mind clicked into gear. Patterns and irregularities had been his professional domain. Something about this didn't add up. James straightened his shoulders, gently returning the photo to its place. The tear had dried on his cheek, leaving the faintest salt trail. The clock chimed the half-hour, jarring him from reflection to reality. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. He composed his features, erasing all evidence of emotional disruption. "Come in," he called, voice steady despite the earthquake that had just reshaped his world. James rose from his chair as the door opened, revealing Thomas, his neighbor and friend of 20 years. Thomas's brow furrowed at the sight of James's face, which apparently showed more than James intended. "Just checking if we're still on for chess tomorrow," Thomas said, hesitating at the threshold. "Everything all right, Jim?" "Fine," James replied. The word clipped short. He gestured vaguely toward the desk. "Just some unexpected news to process." Thomas nodded, understanding the request for privacy without needing explanation. That was the gift of older friendships, knowing when to step back without offense. "Rain check on chess, then?" "I'll call you," James assured him, managing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. After Thomas departed, James stood motionless for exactly 30 seconds, measuring breaths against the ticking clock. Then he moved with surprising purpose toward his home office adjoining the study. The room transformed under the blue glow of dual monitors as James settled into his desk chair. His fingers found the keyboard with practiced familiarity, typing in passwords to access their joint financial accounts. No hesitation. Not even Catherine knew he maintained a spreadsheet with every account number, password, and security question in an encrypted file. Coffee from earlier sat forgotten in his monogrammed mug, now cold and bitter like the task at hand. James adjusted his reading glasses, the same methodical movement he'd made thousands of times during his career securing other people's futures. Now he would secure his own. The joint checking account appeared first, substantial but not their primary assets. Next came the investment portfolio they'd built over decades, retirement accounts, property holdings. His trained eye assessed balances, recent transactions, scheduled transfers. Everything appeared normal, which somehow felt wrong given the seismic shift in his personal landscape. 40 years of partnership reduced to assets and liabilities. His movements were precise as he began restructuring access permissions. Catherine would retain access to their household expense account. He wasn't vindictive. But the retirement funds and investments required immediate protection. Ethical considerations balanced against self-preservation. He ensured she would have living expenses covered while preventing potential liquidation of their life savings. The printer hummed to life, producing documentation of each change. James examined each page carefully before placing it in a fresh manila folder labeled with today's date in his neat accountant's handwriting. Evidence of responsible action, not financial abuse. His throat tightened again as he worked. This wasn't anger driving his actions, but the accumulated wisdom of a career watching how divorce could devastate financial security. At 65, there would be no recovery from financial ruin, a vulnerability unique to their age. A wedding photo sat on the credenza behind him. Without turning, James reached back and gently laid it face down, not in anger, but in concentration. One task at a time. The folder complete, he saved digital copies to his personal drive and logged out of each account. Only when the screens went dark did his shoulders slump momentarily, the weight of the situation pressing down now that the immediate task was complete. The phone remained untouched where he'd left it. No new messages, no explanation, just silence where 40 years of communication had existed. James removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. A question formed that hadn't occurred to him initially. Had Catherine expected this calm, strategic response, or had she anticipated emotional chaos she could navigate to her advantage? His finger tapped thoughtfully on the closed folder. Something about all this felt orchestrated, calculated. The financial planner in him recognized a poorly disclosed strategy when he saw one. The grandfather clock chimed from the study, calling him back to the present moment. Time to make a call of his own. The living room of Elaine Bradford's modernist townhouse couldn't have contrasted more sharply with the Peterson home. Clean lines, abstract art, and furniture that prioritized style over comfort surrounded Catherine as she checked her phone for the 5th time in 20 minutes. "Still nothing?" Elaine asked, refilling Catherine's wine glass. As Catherine's closest friend and confidant for the past decade, she alone knew about today's calculated move. Catherine's manicured nail tapped against the screen impatiently. "Just understood. One word. That's it." "That's unexpected," Elaine said carefully, settling back into her angular chair. "Unexpected? It's infuriating." Catherine set the phone down with more force than necessary on the glass coffee table. "He was supposed to call, text, beg for an explanation, something I could use to show he's unstable or unable to handle this rationally." The bright overhead lighting left nowhere to hide the frustration etching lines around Catherine's mouth. At 63, she still maintained an elegant appearance that belied her age. Designer clothes, carefully maintained blonde hair, subtle cosmetic procedures, all part of the image she'd cultivated in their social circle. "Maybe he's in shock," Elaine suggested, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "It might take time for it to sink in." "No," Catherine shook her head definitively. "I know James. He falls apart when things go off script. Remember when that flight got canceled last year? He was lost, completely dependent on me to rebook everything." She stood, pacing the room with nervous energy. "He can't function without structure, without me managing the social calendar, the family connections." Elaine's expression suggested less certainty. "He did run that financial planning firm for 30 years. Numbers, spreadsheets, that's different." Catherine waved dismissively. "Real life? Emotional situations? He freezes, always has." She retrieved her phone, typing rapidly. "What are you doing?" Elaine leaned forward. "Pushing him, asking about accessing our accounts for expenses." Catherine's smile held no warmth. "That should trigger the panic. He won't know what to do without consulting me first." The message sent with a soft swoosh. Catherine returned to her seat, confidence restored. "By tomorrow, he'll be calling nonstop, leaving emotional messages I can share with the lawyer. Martin says documentation of erratic behavior gives us leverage." Elaine shifted uncomfortably. "And you're sure this is how you want to end 40 years of marriage? A text message seems cold." Something flashed across Catherine's face, perhaps doubt quickly suppressed. "It's strategic. Besides, it's not like we've had a real marriage for years, just two people occupying the same house, going through motions. And the grandchildren? The holidays? They'll adjust." Catherine's tone hardened. "I've given enough years to everyone else. This is about what I want now." The expected notification sound didn't come. Catherine checked her phone again, frowning at the lack of response. He must be staring at it, paralyzed. "Probably hasn't even thought about the accounts yet." Elaine didn't respond, her gaze drifting to a family photo from last Christmas that Catherine had forgotten was displayed on the side table. The Peterson family, James, Catherine, their children and grandchildren, all smiling in matching sweaters. "I should call Martin," Catherine declared, standing abruptly. "He needs to know the timeline has started." As she stepped away to make the call, Elaine studied her friend's tense shoulders, the too bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. For someone who had just executed a long-planned strategy, Catherine didn't look triumphant. She looked unsettled. In the kitchen, Catherine's voice rose with unexpected alarm. "What do you mean he's already done what? Check again. That's not possible. Elaine's gaze returned to the Christmas photo, to James's kind eyes behind his glasses. Perhaps Catherine didn't know her husband as well as she thought. 3 days of silence ended with the doorbell's chime. James set down his morning coffee, straightened his cardigan, and moved unhurriedly to answer. The faces that greeted him caused an almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Catherine's sister Sarah and her husband Robert, their expressions suggesting this wasn't a social call. "We need to talk," Sarah announced, her voice carrying that distinctive Reynolds family authority that had dominated family gatherings for decades. Without waiting for invitation, she stepped past James into the foyer, Robert following with an apologetic glance. James closed the door quietly. "Good morning to you too, Sarah." The living room felt suddenly smaller with Sarah's commanding presence. At 67, she remained a formidable figure, tall, silver-haired, and possessed of absolute certainty in her own opinions. She'd always treated James with a mixture of tolerance and faint disapproval, as if Catherine might have done better. "Catherine is devastated," Sarah began without preamble, declining to sit. "Financially devastated." James maintained his composed expression. "I'm not sure I understand." "Don't play innocent." Sarah's voice sharpened. "You've frozen her out of every account. She can't access a penny of money she's entitled to after 40 years of marriage." Robert stood uncomfortably by the fireplace, examining the collection of family photos as if seeing them for the first time. "That's not accurate," James replied, his tone measured. "I've maintained an account for household expenses with sufficient funds. I've simply secured our retirement accounts and investments pending legal resolution." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You call that sufficient? A pittance! After she dedicated her life to this family, to you?" James felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his breathing steady. "Perhaps we should discuss how this situation began." With a text message demanding divorce and legal-only communication. "She was protecting herself," Sarah shot back, "and clearly with good reason, given your immediate financial retaliation." The accusation hung in the air between them. Financial abuse. The words unspoken, but clearly implied. "I believe I have documentation you should see." James moved toward his study, returning moments later with the precisely labeled folder. His hands remained steady as he opened it on the coffee table. "This contains Catherine's original message, timestamps of account modifications, and confirmation of the household account established in her name with sufficient funds for all reasonable expenses." Sarah barely glanced at the paperwork. "Martin says what you've done constitutes financial abuse of a dependent spouse. Catherine has been a homemaker for decades. She has no independent income. A choice she made," James noted quietly, "despite my encouragement to maintain her real estate license after the children started school. So now it's her fault?" Sarah's voice rose. "Classic. Blame the victim." James felt something shift inside him, anger finally breaking through his carefully maintained composure. Not explosive, but a steady, burning resolve. "I am not the villain in this narrative, Sarah." His voice remained level, but carried new steel. "Catherine chose to end our marriage via text message after 40 years. I responded by protecting our retirement funds from impulsive liquidation while ensuring her immediate needs are covered. That's prudence, not abuse." "Martin says," Sarah began. "Martin is welcome to contact my attorney." James closed the folder decisively. "Which I've retained as of yesterday." Sarah's face flushed. "So that's how it's going to be." Catherine was right. "You've become cold, calculating." "I've become realistic," James corrected, "and I have evidence of every action I've taken, the reasoning behind it, and its accordance with the law. Robert finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Sarah, maybe we should look at the documents." "We don't need to," she snapped, but uncertainty flickered in her expression. "Catherine's family supports her unconditionally." "Even when she's not being entirely truthful?" James asked softly. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its familiar tone now marking the deepening division between families once united. "This isn't over," Sarah declared, moving toward the door. "You'll be hearing from Martin. Catherine deserves half of everything." "She'll receive what's fair under the law," James agreed. "Nothing more, nothing less." After they departed, James returned to the study where their wedding photo still lay face down on the credenza. His hand trembled slightly as he righted it, studying Catherine's smiling face from decades earlier. "Why this way?" he whispered to the empty room. "What were you really planning?" The morning light caught on a business card lying on his desk. Thomas's brother-in-law, one of the most respected divorce attorneys in the county. James reached for his phone, the pattern emerging more clearly with each passing day. Catherine had expected chaos. Instead, she'd face order, documentation, and the methodical mind of a man who'd spent his life planning for contingencies. The Thomas household had hosted the neighborhood's monthly dinner gathering for 15 years. James had never missed one until tonight. His absence created a conspicuous void at the usual table, a topic carefully avoided until coffee was served. "Is Jim under the weather?" Eleanor Harris asked, the retired school teacher's concern appearing genuine despite the curiosity beneath. Thomas exchanged glances with his wife before responding carefully. "He sends his regrets. Some personal matters needed his attention." "We heard Catherine moved out," Margaret Wilson interjected, her tone suggesting she knew considerably more. "To Elaine Bradford's guest house. Temporarily, of course." The silence that followed carried unspoken questions. James and Catherine had been fixtures in their social circle for decades, committee chairs at the community center, hosts of the annual 4th of July barbecue, reliable volunteers for fundraisers. "Well," Margaret continued when no one filled the pause, "Sarah Reynolds tells me it's quite a difficult situation, something about financial improprieties." Thomas set down his coffee cup with unusual firmness. "I wouldn't put much stock in second-hand information, Margaret." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but the damage was done. The narrative was spreading. James Peterson, financial abuser, controller, villain in a story he barely recognized. Alone in the too-quiet house, James sat at the dining table where family gatherings had filled every available chair for decades. Tonight, a single plate held food he couldn't taste. A single glass of water reflected the overhead light. The silence pressed against his ears like a physical force. His phone displayed 3 new messages. From the community center. Given the circumstances, perhaps stepping back from the fundraising committee would be best for everyone right now. From his daughter Elizabeth. "Dad, what's going on?" "Aunt Sarah called me. Please tell me you haven't frozen Mom out financially." From his golf partner of 12 years, "Need to reschedule our tea time. Something came up." James set the phone face down beside his plate. The isolation was methodical, spreading through circles of his life like ripples in still water. Catherine's narrative was prevailing without challenge, the devoted wife suddenly cut off from resources by a controlling husband. For the first time since receiving that text message, James felt something crack in his carefully maintained composure. His hand trembled as he pushed away the untouched food. Was I wrong? Too clinical? Too calculated? The question circled his mind as he moved to the living room where decades of family photos documented birthdays, graduations, weddings. His grandchildren's faces smiled from silver frames. Would they now hear stories of their controlling grandfather? Would weekend visits become awkward, supervised exchanges? James sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 65 years. The future he'd planned so meticulously, retirement trips, college funds for grandchildren, holiday traditions in this very home, all now uncertain. At an age when time became increasingly precious, how much would be lost to legal battles and damaged relationships? His chest tightened with an unfamiliar sensation, not quite panic, but a profound sense of powerlessness despite his careful preparations. The financial security he'd built couldn't protect against this particular form of loss. The weight of it bent him forward, elbows on knees, head bowed. For the first time since childhood, James Peterson wept without restraint. No one was there to witness the tears that fell onto the hardwood floor, the shuddering breaths that broke the silence of the empty house. Has betrayal ever left you standing alone while others believed the worst? Share your experience below. Like if this resonates with your heart, follow to see if justice will prevail against these accusations. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, each note marking another hour of solitude. James wiped his face with a handkerchief, the momentary surrender to grief leaving him drained but somehow clearer. He straightened, drawing a deep breath. The phone lit up with another message. Expecting more withdrawal, more accusations, he almost didn't look. When he finally turned it over, the name surprised him. Robert Reynolds. Jim, I looked at those documents. Something doesn't add up with Catherine's story. Can we talk privately? James stared at the message from his sister-in-law's husband, unexpected ally from an unexpected quarter. The narrative Catherine had constructed so carefully had its first crack. He rose from the chair, shoulders straightening slightly. Perhaps isolation wasn't as complete as it had seemed. Perhaps truth, methodically presented, still held power. His finger hovered over the response field. This time, one word wouldn't suffice. Robert Reynolds looked distinctly uncomfortable seated across from James in the small coffee shop 15 miles from their neighborhood, far enough to avoid accidental encounters with mutual acquaintances. His fingers tapped nervously on the ceramic mug, wedding band catching the morning light. "Sarah doesn't know I'm here," he began, voice low despite the ambient chatter providing privacy. "She wouldn't understand." James nodded, patient. In 35 years of financial planning, he'd learned the value of letting people reach conclusions at their own pace. "I looked at those documents you showed us," Robert continued. "The timestamps, the account statements. Then I asked Catherine some questions when Sarah wasn't around." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The timeline she gave doesn't match the evidence." "I'm listening," James said, keeping his tone neutral despite the vindication warming his chest. Robert leaned forward. "Catherine told Sarah she tried to access the accounts for regular expenses and found herself locked out without warning. But your documentation shows you established that household account immediately with sufficient funds." "I did." "And her text message—" Robert's brow furrowed. "Sarah said Catherine only sent that after you'd already restricted access." "But the timestamps show the opposite," James finished quietly. "Her demand for divorce and legal-only communication came first. My financial actions followed as a responsible response." Robert nodded slowly, conflict evident in his expression. Family loyalty battling with uncomfortable truth. "There's more," he finally said. "Martin Goldstein has been Catherine's attorney for months, not days. I overheard her on a call with him back in January discussing options. January, 3 months before the text message." James absorbed this revelation with outward calm, though it confirmed his growing suspicion of long-term calculation. "Thank you for telling me," James said simply. "I'm not taking sides," Robert clarified quickly. "But Sarah's repeating things that don't align with evidence, and that's not right, not after 40 years of marriage." James recognized the courage this conversation required. Robert had been family for 30 years. Choosing truth over comfortable allegiance couldn't have been easy. "What will you do now?" Robert asked. "Meet with my attorney this afternoon. Present the evidence. Follow the legal process." James kept his response measured, though internally pieces were falling into place with increasing clarity. Robert seemed to study him with new perspective. "You know, Catherine always described you as indecisive with anything outside of financial matters. Said you'd fall apart without her managing the personal side of life." A small, sad smile crossed James's face. "A convenient narrative if you're planning to portray someone as incompetent." They parted with a handshake firmer than any they'd shared before. Not quite allies, but no longer adversaries. The law office of Patricia Montgomery occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian building downtown. Unlike the sleek, intimidating glass towers of larger firms, her space featured warm wood paneling, comfortable chairs, and bookshelves lined with well-used legal volumes. At 72, Patricia could have retired years ago, but continued practicing selectively, her reputation for both brilliance and ethical standards making her services highly sought after. 40 years, she mused, reviewing the timeline James had prepared, and ended by text message. "That's cold, even by today's standards." James sat across from her desk, back straight, despite the emotional weight of recent days. "I'd like to understand why. The calculated nature of it all." Patricia's experienced eyes studied him over reading glasses. "Most people in your position would lead with anger, demands for payback. You're leading with a desire to understand. Anger doesn't clarify, it clouds." She nodded approvingly. "Tell me about these financial moves you made after receiving the text." For the next hour, James walked her through each decision, each account modification, each provision made for Catherine's needs. Patricia took meticulous notes, occasionally requesting clarification, but mostly listening with the focused attention that had made her legendary in courtrooms. "You've built quite a strong position," she finally said, removing her glasses. "The evidence directly contradicts the narrative being circulated. Catherine's claim of financial abuse falls apart under scrutiny. Will that matter? Narratives can be powerful despite evidence. In court, evidence prevails," Patricia assured him. "And I suspect Catherine's attorney knows it. That's why they're spreading this story socially first, hoping you'll crack under isolation pressure and agree to unfavorable terms before a judge reviews the facts." For the first time in days, James felt his shoulders relax slightly. Having his actions validated by a respected professional lifted a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. "There's something else," Patricia said, tapping her pen against the folder. "Catherine's demand for legal-only communication actually works in our favor. It creates a clear paper trail, prevents any claim of verbal agreements, and frankly removes emotion from the process." James considered this irony, the very mechanism intended to isolate him, providing protection instead. "What's our next step?" he asked. "Preparation, documentation, and patience." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "This won't be quick, James, or painless, but truth has staying power that narratives don't." As James left the office, his phone displayed a text from his daughter Elizabeth. "Dad, I talked to Uncle Robert. Can we meet tomorrow? I think I need to hear your side directly." In the afternoon sunlight, James paused on the sidewalk, allowing himself to feel the first genuine hope since this ordeal began. The isolation Catherine had engineered wasn't impenetrable after all. Evidence still mattered. Truth still had advocates. He typed a response to his daughter, his fingers steady and sure. "I would like that very much. How about breakfast at Millie's? 9 a.m. The reply came almost immediately. "I'll be there." The morning sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows of James's kitchen as he straightened his tie. The house felt different today. Not quite as empty, not quite as silent. Elizabeth's visit yesterday had shifted something fundamental. His daughter had listened, examined his evidence, and ultimately embraced him with tears in her eyes, whispering, "I'm sorry I doubted you, Dad." One family member returned to his corner. One crack in Catherine's carefully constructed narrative. Today would widen that crack considerably. The preliminary hearing for temporary support arrangements wasn't a full trial, but it would establish the tone for everything that followed. First impressions before a judge carried weight. James checked his reflection in the hallway mirror. At 65, he still maintained the disciplined appearance of his professional years. Silver hair neatly trimmed, tie precisely knotted, posture straight, despite the emotional burdens of recent weeks. The face looking back at him showed new lines around the eyes, perhaps, but also a clarity that had been missing during those initial days of shock. His phone chimed with a message from Patricia. "Remember, let the evidence speak. No matter what accusations fly, maintain your composure. Judge Hartman appreciates facts over emotion." Sound advice. James tucked the phone into his jacket pocket and picked up the leather portfolio containing copies of all documentation. Everything meticulously organized, tabbed, and highlighted. The work of a lifetime in financial planning now applied to his own defense. The doorbell rang precisely at 8:15 a.m. Thomas stood on the porch, car keys in hand, offering a supportive smile. "Ready for this?" he asked as James locked the front door. "As ready as circumstances allow," James replied, his voice steady despite the flicker of nervousness in his stomach. The drive downtown passed in comfortable silence. Thomas had proven himself a true friend throughout this ordeal, one of the few who had withheld judgment, who had seen through the spreading rumors to the man he'd known for decades. "You know," Thomas said as they approached the courthouse, "I always thought Catherine was the emotional core of your marriage, and you were the practical foundation." James glanced at his friend. That was her preferred narrative. "I see that now," Thomas nodded. "But watching you these past weeks, there's a strength there that has nothing to do with spreadsheets and account numbers." The observation touched something deep in James. For years, decades perhaps, he had accepted Catherine's characterization of him as emotionally dependent, socially awkward, without her guidance. That self-image had been systematically dismantled by this crisis, revealing something more resilient underneath. "Thank you for that," he said simply as they parked. The courthouse steps loomed ahead, imposing in their granite solidity. James paused at the bottom, drawing a deep breath. "Have you ever had to stand your ground when others tried to make you doubt yourself? Comment your experience, like if you faced similar challenges. Follow to witness the courtroom showdown and final judgment." "I'll be in the gallery," Thomas assured him, clasping his shoulder briefly before they entered the building. The preliminary hearing room was smaller than James had imagined, with dark wood paneling and the state seal mounted behind the judge's bench. Patricia Montgomery waited inside, her presence commanding despite her diminutive stature. She nodded approvingly at James's punctuality. "Martin's requesting $9,500 monthly in temporary support," she informed him quietly, plus continued residence for Catherine in the family home. James absorbed this without visible reaction. though the number struck him as deliberately excessive. That would drain the accounts within 18 months. Precisely why we're contesting it, Patricia agreed. Judge Hartman is fair, but expects solid documentation. The door opened again, and James felt rather than saw Catherine enter with her attorney. For the first time since her text message, they occupied the same room. He kept his gaze forward, maintaining composure despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Martin Goldstein's reputation preceded him, aggressive, theatrical, skilled at creating emotional narratives that distracted from factual weaknesses. His tailored suit and confident stride spoke of countless courtroom victories. Catherine seated herself beside her attorney, her profile familiar yet somehow foreign after their separation. She'd had her hair styled differently, James noticed, wore a conservative dress that emphasized her role as the dedicated homemaker, every detail calculated for maximum sympathy. As if sensing his assessment, she turned slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time. Something flickered across her expression. Surprise, perhaps, at his composed appearance. She had expected him diminished, James realized, broken by isolation and accusations. Instead, he sat straight-backed beside his attorney, portfolio open, evidence organized, expression resolute. Not angry, not destroyed, simply prepared. Catherine looked away first. The bailiff called for attention as Judge Eleanor Hartman entered, a silver-haired woman whose reputation for cutting through emotional appeals with laser focus on facts had made her both respected and feared in family court. "All rise," the bailiff announced. James stood, straightening his tie once more. The moment of confrontation had arrived. Weeks of isolation and accusation would now face the disinfectant of evidence and sworn testimony. As the judge took her seat, James caught Patricia's reassuring nod. Truth had staying power that narratives didn't. Today would prove it. The court will now hear Peterson versus Peterson regarding temporary support and residence. Judge Hartman's voice carried authority without unnecessary volume. Her gaze swept the small courtroom, settling briefly on each party before continuing. "Mr. Goldstein, you may present your case for the petitioner." Martin Goldstein rose with practiced grace, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the bench. At 58, he'd built his reputation on emotional appeals that often swayed judges in family court. "Your Honor, Catherine Peterson dedicated 40 years of her life to supporting her husband's career and raising their family," he began, gesturing toward Catherine, who sat with perfect posture and appropriately somber expression. She managed their household, their social calendar, their family connections, enabling Mr. Peterson to focus entirely on his financial planning business. James maintained his composed expression, though the selective portrayal of their marriage felt like fiction. Catherine had indeed managed their social life, but largely to her own preferences. The children's activities, family visits, holiday planning, all had fallen primarily to him while she focused on community committees and social status. Now, after 4 decades of marriage, Goldstein continued, his voice taking on a note of carefully calibrated outrage, Mr. Peterson has unilaterally restricted Mrs. Peterson's access to marital assets, leaving her financially vulnerable at 63 years of age with no independent income. Judge Hartman's expression remained neutral. "And your request is?" "Temporary support of $9,500 monthly, Your Honor, plus exclusive residence in the family home during proceedings. This amount reflects the standard of living Mrs. Peterson has maintained throughout the marriage. James noticed Catherine's slight nod, as if the amount were completely reasonable rather than deliberately excessive. "Miss Montgomery?" Judge Hartman turned to James's attorney. Patricia rose unhurriedly, her movements economical compared to Goldstein's theatrical style. "Your Honor, we contest both the characterization of events and the requested support amount. With the court's permission, I'd like to establish the actual sequence of events with documentation." "Proceed." Patricia approached with a folder. Exhibit A contains the initial communication from Mrs. Peterson to Mr. Peterson, delivered via text message on April 10th at 6:42 p.m. As you'll note, Mrs. Peterson explicitly demanded divorce and specified all communication through lawyers from now on. The judge reviewed the printed message, her eyebrows rising slightly. Exhibit B shows Mr. Peterson's full account actions following this message. Within 24 hours, he established a separate household account for Mrs. Peterson with $12,000 initial deposit and recurring monthly transfers of $4,000, more than sufficient for all reasonable expenses. Patricia's voice remained matter-of-fact. He secured joint retirement accounts from impulsive liquidation while ensuring Mrs. Peterson's immediate needs were fully covered. Goldstein shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this level of documentation. Furthermore, Patricia continued, Exhibit C demonstrates that Mrs. Peterson had been consulting with Mr. Goldstein for approximately 3 months prior to sending the divorce text, suggesting this was not an impulsive decision but a calculated strategy. Catherine's composed facade cracked slightly, her eyes darting to her attorney in alarm. This was information they hadn't anticipated James possessing. Judge Hartman reviewed each document carefully before looking up. "Mr. Goldstein, does your client dispute the authenticity of these communications or the timeline presented?" Goldstein rose, momentarily thrown off his prepared arguments. "Your Honor, regardless of the exact sequence, the fact remains that Mrs. Peterson requires appropriate support." "That wasn't my question," Judge Hartman interrupted. "Does Mrs. Peterson dispute the authenticity of these documents?" Goldstein conferred briefly with Catherine, whose expression had tightened considerably. "No, Your Honor, but context is important." "Indeed it is," Judge Hartman agreed. "And the context appears to be that Mrs. Peterson initiated divorce proceedings with a demand for legal-only communication, after which Mr. Peterson took reasonable steps to secure shared assets while providing for immediate expenses." She turned to Patricia. "What is your client requesting, Ms. Montgomery?" "Mr. Peterson proposes temporary support of $4,000 monthly, the amount already being provided, which covers all household expenses based on their actual historical spending documented in Exhibit D. He is not requesting that Mrs. Peterson vacate the family home at this time, merely that the support amount be reasonable and based on factual need rather than punitive in nature. The judge reviewed the final exhibit, nodding slightly. "Mr. Goldstein, any response?" Goldstein launched into an argument about Catherine's contributions to the marriage, her social standing requirements, and the emotional distress of divorce. But James could see from Judge Hartman's expression that the narrative had shifted fundamentally. Evidence had indeed prevailed over emotion. After brief deliberation, Judge Hartman delivered her ruling. The court sets temporary support at $4,500 monthly, finding this amount sufficient for reasonable expenses based on the documentation provided. Both parties may continue to access the family home by mutual agreement until final settlement. Further, the court notes with concern the deliberate mischaracterization of financial actions in the initial filing. Her gaze settled briefly on Catherine. "Honesty before this court is not optional, Mrs. Peterson. Future filings should reflect factual accuracy. The gavel struck with finality. Catherine's face registered shock, then anger as she turned to Goldstein in disbelief. James remained seated as the courtroom began to clear, allowing the moment to settle. Not triumph. There was no joy in these proceedings, but vindication. The facts had spoken. The truth had prevailed. Patricia gathered their materials with efficient movements. "A good outcome," she said quietly. "Judge Hartman doesn't forget misrepresentations. This sets a favorable tone for final proceedings." As James rose to leave, he caught Catherine's gaze across the room. For a brief moment, he saw something unexpected in her expression, not just anger, but surprise, perhaps even respect. She had underestimated him fundamentally, built her strategy on a caricature of the man she'd lived with for 40 years. That miscalculation would shape everything that followed. The key turned smoothly in the lock, the familiar sound somehow different now that ownership had been legally settled. 6 months had passed since that preliminary hearing. 6 months of depositions, negotiations, and finally, resolution. The divorce was final, assets divided equitably by court order rather than emotional manipulation. James stepped into the entryway of what was now solely his home. Catherine had chosen the downtown condominium in the final settlement, taking selected furniture and personal items, but leaving the family home to him. A surprising concession her lawyer had presented after the judge's initial ruling set the tone for proceedings. Afternoon light filtered through windows that had witnessed 40 years of a marriage now concluded. The house felt neither empty nor full, but somewhere in between, like a canvas partially painted, waiting for new colors. He set his keys on the hallway table, the small sound echoing slightly in the modified space. Some rooms remained largely unchanged. His study, the kitchen he'd always preferred cooking in despite Catherine's narrative about handling domestic matters. Others had transformed through subtle adjustments, furniture rearranged to his preference. Catherine's formal sitting room now converted to a reading nook with comfortable chairs for when grandchildren visited. The grandchildren, that had been his greatest fear, losing connection with them amid the divorce narrative. But Elizabeth and their son Michael had seen through the accusations once presented with evidence. Weekend visits had resumed, awkward at first, but gradually settling into new routines. Last Sunday, 7-year-old Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder while he read her favorite story, a moment of simple perfection that reassured him some bonds transcended legal proceedings. James moved to the kitchen, setting the kettle on for tea, a small ritual marking the day's significance. The final paperwork had been filed this morning, the last signatures applied, the legal process complete. He was, officially and irrevocably, divorced at 65. There was no triumph in the thought, no celebration appropriate for the end of something that had occupied most of his adult life. Yet neither was there the crushing despair that had gripped him during those early weeks of isolation and accusation. What remained was a quiet dignity, a sense of having navigated a storm with integrity intact. His reflection caught in the window glass, silver hair, lined face, eyes that had seen both joy and betrayal. Not the broken man Catherine had expected when she sent that text message. Not the socially helpless, emotionally dependent husband she had described to others for years. Just James Peterson, more resilient than even he had known. The kettle whistled, calling him back to the present moment. As he prepared his tea, his phone chimed with a message from Thomas. "Committee meeting still on for Saturday. They're hoping you'll return as treasurer." James smiled slightly. The community connections Catherine had predicted would abandon him had gradually returned as the truth emerged. Not all. Some relationships had proven too shallow to survive the test, but enough, the ones that mattered. He carried his tea to the back porch, settling into the wooden swing that had been his private refuge for decades. The garden beyond needed attention after months of minimal care during legal proceedings. Perhaps that would be tomorrow's project, clearing away what had died, preparing soil for new growth. An apt metaphor, he reflected, for this unexpected chapter of life. On the small table beside the swing lay a travel brochure Elizabeth had brought during her last visit. The coastal Maine trip he'd mentioned wanting to take for years, but had always deferred to Catherine's preference for more social destinations. "You should go, Dad," his daughter had encouraged. "Just for yourself." Just for himself. The concept still felt foreign after decades of compromise and accommodation, yet increasingly possible. James sipped his tea, watching the late afternoon light shift across the garden. At 65, he had perhaps 20 good years ahead, if health permitted. 20 years that had abruptly shifted from a long-planned shared retirement to an entirely uncharted path. The thought no longer carried the dread it once had. From inside, the grandfather clock chimed 5 times, the sound carrying through the open door. The timepiece had been his grandfather's, its mechanism maintained through decades by James's careful hands. It would continue marking time in this house, witnessing whatever came next. He set down his empty cup and picked up the Maine brochure, allowing himself to consider possibilities. Coastal walks, lighthouse tours, photography perhaps, a hobby long set aside, no social obligations dictating the schedule, no compromise required on destinations or activities. A small weathered notebook lay beside the brochure, his planning journal, begun in those first weeks after Catherine's text, when focusing on future steps had provided stability amid emotional chaos. The early pages contained practical matters, attorney contacts, account numbers, court dates. The middle section held darker entries from periods of isolation and doubt. The most recent pages, however, looked forward. Travel ideas, home improvement projects, community involvements renewed on his own terms. James added garden restoration to the list, his handwriting steady and clear. Then, after a moment's consideration, Maine, September? The question mark was tentative but hopeful. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, James remained on the porch swing, gently rocking. Not rushing toward whatever came next, but not resisting it either. The betrayal that had shattered his expected future had also, unexpectedly, revealed strengths he hadn't known he possessed and possibilities he hadn't thought to imagine. There was grief in endings, certainly, but there could also be dignity, even grace, and perhaps, most surprisingly, the quiet anticipation of beginnings. Isn't it something, how life can change in an instant? One moment, you're living the life you've spent decades building, and the next, a text message, a letter, a single conversation, and everything shifts beneath your feet. Maybe you've been there yourself, sitting in a quiet room like James, feeling the floor drop away as someone you trusted rewrote the story of your life together. You know that feeling, don't you, friend? That moment when betrayal first stings, sharp as winter air, bitter as burnt coffee. When tears come whether you want them to or not. When the photos on your mantle suddenly feel like artifacts from someone else's life. Trust breaks in the most ordinary places. At kitchen tables where you've shared thousands of meals. In living rooms where children once played at your feet. On porches where you planned futures that now look nothing like you imagined. The cruelest part isn't just the loss, It's how betrayal makes you question every memory, every moment you thought you understood. But here's what I've come to believe. Those moments of deepest hurt can reveal strengths we never knew we possessed. Like James, you might discover that you're not who others claimed you were. That the wisdom accumulated through decades, the patience, the perspective, the practiced eye that notices what others miss, becomes your most powerful ally. Those skills you've honed through years of living. They're not just for careers or raising families. They're for surviving storms you never saw coming. There's a particular dignity in standing tall after 60-some years, isn't there? In refusing to let someone else's betrayal define your remaining chapters. The hands that tremble with grief one day can steadily rebuild the next. The heart that cracks doesn't have to stay broken. I think about that porch swing where James sat at story's end, planning new possibilities. Maybe you have a place like that, a kitchen chair in early morning light, a garden bench as evening falls. A place where you sit and remember who you've always been beneath the roles others assigned you. You've earned every line on your face, every skill in your arsenal, every ounce of resilience in your spirit. When betrayal comes, and sooner or later it finds us all, remember that your story doesn't end with someone else's choices. It continues with yours. The clock keeps ticking. The garden waits for new seeds. And you, with all your years, all your wisdom, all your capacity for both tears and joy, you remain the author of what happens next.